Hi, my name is Sunsara Taylor, and I want to talk about the new laws, the so-called right to know and see laws, including the one that was recently passed in Virginia, which are laws that require a woman to undergo a forced sonogram before she's allowed to get an abortion. Now, before I get into that more fully, I want to define a word. And the word is a Pyrrhic victory. Now maybe you know this word, but essentially it means that you win a particular victory, but you win it in such a way that you lay the groundwork for your ultimate defeat and demise. And there's really no other way I can think to describe the victory of the pro-choice movement and of the Democratic Party for defeating a certain element of this bill, which was passed in Virginia, which was the element that would have not only required a woman to undergo a sonogram and view the fetus, but to undergo a vaginally administered sonogram. So, just to be clear, don't get me wrong, I think it was absolutely correct for the pro-choice movement to say that to force a woman to be penetrated by a probe in her vagina for no medical reason, but to image a fetus that then they have to view before getting an abortion, it was absolutely correct to call that state-mandated rape. Absolutely correct. But the problem was that they left it at that. They didn't say that this just concentrates the woman-hating nature and woman-hating reality of the entire movement to demonize, criminalize, and stigmatize abortion, and that the entire framework is illegitimate. Their framework is forced motherhood and female enslavement. And because nobody came out and said the problem with this bill is not merely that it mandated state-sponsored rape, but that it mandated the stigmatizing and guilt-tripping and interference with a woman's ability to determine for herself when and whether she'll have a child, because nobody came out and said abortion on demand and without apology, we have a situation where that particular element was defeated, but the law got passed. And that's what happened. Just a few days later, Bob McDonnell, governor of Virginia, took out the vaginal probe element of the legislation and got the mandatory sonogram laws passed. And this was not only in Virginia. This law has already been passed in Texas. It's been introduced in Mississippi, Alabama, Oklahoma, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Idaho, and other places. So really, there's still a losing dynamic going on here. This is a dynamic we have to rupture with. Everybody who cares about the right of women to abortion, to determine their own future, we have to come out and fight for abortion on demand without apology and to tell the truth. Now, this brings me back to the right to know and see law. Because just the name of that bill, which requires a woman to get the sonogram, is so dishonest and so manipulative. I just have to speak to this. They claim that before a woman makes a major decision like getting an abortion, she has the right to know and to see the fetus. But I want to pose to Bob McDonnell and all the other theocrats in the halls of power, what about the right of women to know that a fetus is not a baby? What about the right of everybody to know that a fetus is a subordinate part of a woman's body? That it is not an independent social being, it's not an independent biological being. Yes, it's developing, it has the potential to become a human, but until it's born, it's a subordinate part of a woman's body. Where's the right to know that? What about the right of women and people throughout society to understand basic science about human reproduction and human evolution altogether, and evolution in general? What about the right to know that there is no such thing as the, quote, miracle of life? There is the scientific process of an egg meeting a sperm and developing over time. There's no miracle involved, there's no God involved, there's no mystery, there's no mysticism, it's science. What about the right to know that? What about the right for women and other people to know that the entire anti-abortion movement has never been driven out of concern for women or even concern for so-called babies? It's been driven at its core for decades by the biblical mandate that women bear children and obey their husbands. If you look into the anti-abortion movement, at its core, it's always been the biblical scripture that women, we caused original sin, we ate from the tree of knowledge, we tempted Adam, and we got kicked out of the Garden of Eden, we caused the fall of man, and everything bad that has ever happened since. And in the book of Timothy, it's commanded that the only way that women can redeem ourselves is by obeying our husbands and bearing children. What about the right to know that that's actually what motivates the anti-abortion movement? And that's also why, as we are seeing more and more clearly now, the entire anti-abortion movement has always been anti-birth control. What about the right to know that? And what about the right of women and others to know that the only reason why this arcane biblical scripture written by patriarchal, agrarian, slave-owning men years ago, thousands of years ago, the only reason this is still being dredged up and used to enforce legislation over our lives and our bodies is because we live in a patriarchal, class-divided, capitalist society. And that ever since the first emergence of classes and the state and private property, the state and the church have had an interest in controlling women's reproduction and sexuality, because this is required if you want to control inheritance lines, if you want to control property relations, if you want to control the socialization of children, and the maintenance of different divided classes. What about the right of people to know that the only reason this outmoded beliefs are still being pushed in law is because we live in an outmoded capitalist society? And finally, what about the right of people to know that this is not the best of all possible worlds, that a different world is possible at this point in human history? We can make a revolution. In fact, it's been done before, and it's brought about incredible liberation for people who have lived in those societies, first in the Soviet Union and then in China before those revolutions were defeated. What about the right to know that? And even more, what about the right to know that those revolutions have been summed up and learned from? And they've been what's been done right, what was done wrong, and what's been learned more broadly. That there's a leader, his name is Bob Avakian, who's developed a new synthesis of revolution and communism. And because of this, we can make revolution again, and we can do it even better. What about the right to know that the world could be different, and we could be part of fighting for that? This is something that you need to know. You have a right to know, and you have an obligation to get into. You should go and check this out at Revolution newspaper. There's a special declaration for the liberation of women and the emancipation of humanity that gets into the origins of women's oppression and how we can make a revolution to emancipate women as part of emancipating all of humanity. You have a right to know that, you have a responsibility to get into it. But also, or perhaps finally, I want to say, it is total bullshit for Bob McDonnell or any of these other legislators to talk about the right to know. They pimp off of people's ignorance, which they help enforce, okay? The Christian fascist movement and all those who bow down to it and compromise and capitulate with it, they foster ignorance, they foster patriarchal traditions, and then they prey on people who've been kept in ignorance to use that against them. And so let me just say, they have no right to speak about the right to know. They also have no right to rule. It's outmoded, it's arcane, and we have to fight it and get rid of it. So you should get into that. And as you do, as part of learning more about that, but also changing the world as we do, and wherever you're coming from, we have to be fighting the power and transforming the people today. The whole first part of what I had to say has to do with why the Democrats are not going to be the saviors here. They are just leading people to kneel down and bow down to there's a little bit by little bit, but to the overall assault where we're losing ground. We have to fight ourselves. We have to stand up and say, women are not incubators, we are human beings. Forced motherhood is female enslavement. There is a war on women, it's not going away, and we have a right and a responsibility to fight it. So I want to invite you and call on you to get into the revolution, but also to join me on International Women's Day. We are standing up against the war on women. We are taking to the streets. We are starting at St. Patrick's Cathedral because of their attacks on birth control and abortion. We're marching to the U.S. Military Recruiting Center because of the concentration of violence against women in the military and the use of the military of brothels around the world and its direct role in trafficking women around the world. We are marching to the strip clubs in the area because we're saying women are not objects, we're not things to be bought and sold, and we need a different culture, and we need to fight for it now. And doing this on March 10th for International Women's Day in New York City is part of building up the strength and saying this has to stop now. We're changing all of society around this. We're changing the momentum and the direction of the war on women. But we're also building up the strength so that when the chance comes, and we're transforming people, so that we can actually make a revolution. Yesterday would not be too soon.